our brown bag session this month. We have Overseas Chinese at Rancho Peñasquitos by Mark Thompson. My name is Stephanie Sandoval, and I'm the Public Archaeology Director here at the San Diego Archaeological Center. Our next two events that we have coming up, we have a living room lecture. So those are our Thursday evening lectures. On October 8th, we have Geoglyphs of the Desert Southwest by Ann Morgan. And our next brown bag on October 14th is Chicano Park, San Diego Sistine Chapel by Marty Rosen. And both of those can be, you can register for both of those through our website at www.sandiegoarchaeology.org. We will open up for questions for the talk at the end, so feel free to either unmute yourself and ask your question. If you prefer, you can also put it into chat, and Dante will read your question aloud. So either way, both ways we'll take questions. I am very pleased to introduce Mark Thompson. He has had 2 seasons at the Rancho Peñasquitos Ranch House with Palomar College, and I'm very excited to hear his present his research with us today. So I will turn it over to Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, first I want to thank the Center for inviting me in to talk about San Diego history today. Second, I'd like to throw out a thanks to Dr. Payne and Dr. Amy from Palomar College. I don't know if they're with us yet, but they've been encouraging me to continue my research in this area. And this report itself has grown out of work conducted at the ranch under their direction. To begin, I should explain 3 things. 1, where the Rancho is, what the Johnson-Taylor House is, and who exactly the Overseas Chinese are. After that, then we can roll forward. So basically, let's see, come on. Now it's not paging down all of a sudden.
Try and click it with your mouse first, and then it might work.
There we go. Okay. So this map shows Penasquitos Canyon. It's approximately 20 miles from downtown, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's located basically between the southern part of Del Mar and the entryway to Poway to the east. The canyon itself is an arc of about 7 miles down through the center. And understanding the history of Rancho Peñasquitos and the Los Penasquitos Rancho, it's important to recognize 3 sites. 1, the El Cuervo adobe, the Johnson-Taylor House over here, and the Monarchy adobe. These are 3 structures and associated smaller buildings that factor into the story of the canyon. And if we have time, I'd like to circle back to this later. There may actually be a 4th site here that hasn't really been investigated thoroughly. But all of it collectively develops the story of the canyon. Let's see, the Johnson-Taylor House itself, this slide shows a plan view of the house. It's a single-level domestic ranch-style structure built in 1862. George Johnson gets credit for it, but really he heavily modified a pre-existing adobe that dates back to the original land grant and the original owner of Francisco Ruiz. So around 1823, Ruiz built this wing, designated the A wing, and had a very modest structure at that location, basically just enough to support his claim to the grant, which came from the Spanish mission. And his rancho overall was much larger than the image shown of the canyon itself. His ranch was close to 9,000 acres and actually included a big chunk of the Mira Mesa area, Sereno Valley, and further to the north. This building is designated as a historical structure and has extensive reporting about it. In terms of the Overseas Chinese, the subject of this discussion, basically Overseas Chinese were individuals who were Chinese citizens. They voluntarily left China in the 1800s and 1900s, basically to look for work overseas. Majority of these individuals came from the Canton region, and Canton basically, for us in a modern time, basically is, think of it as Hong Kong and the surrounding geography. And Canton and Hong Kong were basically the jumping off point for many places around the world. A lot of people from the area ultimately went to Southeast Asia, they went to Australia, and they came to the United States via San Francisco. And for the most part, those individuals traveling in, say, around 1850 to the United States were coming over because they were going to be part of the gold rush. They had heard about gold being discovered, and people were excited to come and try and basically find the mountain of gold, which was the rumor in China that you could strike your fortune very easily. During this time, it was interesting that they actually had Chinese labor brokers, individuals that would handle recruiting, transportation, and distributing workers to whatever industry needed them. Initially, this was for the gold rush operations, later for the railroad that was being built. Ultimately, these individuals found their way to mining camps and logging camps and ranch operations. Some of them even found their way to Arizona to work on the Colorado River steamboat operations. So it was basically a large distribution network of individuals. And one of the things that the brokers actually did was they would provide death insurance. And if the Chinese workers died while outside of China, the broker would handle the repatriation of their remains back to China, because there was a big cultural belief that they needed to be buried in China. In other words, otherwise they would become a ghost if they weren't interned properly. So the ranch has an extended history starting with the mission era, and that's all pretty well documented. But most of what is known is associated with the landowners and their immediate family, the so-called elite people. These are George and Estefana Johnson. So they were the owning family members in 1880. And there's a tremendous amount of historical information available for these individuals. They were basically the superstars of San Diego County at this time. They were considered to be very wealthy. She had been considered one of the most beautiful women in California in 1859. He basically courted her and married her and became owner of one of the largest ranch holdings in the county and certainly in California. But overall, there's been very little attention given to non-elite populations on the ranch, such as workers. And that's what got me started about thinking about the overseas Chinese. Initially, I became interested in this in 2018 when we were working on an excavation of a suspected bunkhouse, basically a structure that doesn't exist anymore, away from the main house shown here. This was basically the JohnsonTaylor House. There was a very large barn on the property at one point. Their spring house is down here. And there's another structure out here and even one up here that aren't very well documented. But Chinese workers have been documented at many other ranches in California, but now Rancho Peñasquitos. And so I considered several questions about this, including what evidence might support their presence, how did they get there, what was their experience on the ranch, and what happened to them. So the story starts really with the passage to the United States. A typical transit for these individuals would last about a month. Very often the ships would travel through Japan as well, but it was a pretty slow process. This individual ship, City of Peking, made a number of runs back and forth. And as you can tell, it's basically still a fairly primitive looking steamship. They have basically masts for sails. And this particular ship actually lost part of its propeller one time and had to proceed the rest of the way under sail. So the crews of these ships were still basically, old-time sailing ship capable sailors, even though it ran predominantly on steam. But the passenger manifests for these types of ships and their trips are particularly interesting because it breaks down the passengers into basically three classes. Normally what you'd expect: first class, second class, and steerage. In this case, the first class passengers on the manifest would all be identified by name. And in this case, there were 46 individuals on this particular trip. It gave their name, their relationships, an individual and their wife and family, and often mentioned that they were traveling with servants. The second class passengers were also named individually on the manifest, but possibly only if they were white. Other individuals were not listed on the second class cabins. And then you had the steerage passengers, which basically would only be listed in terms of a head count. And in this case, they would just say 1,300 Chinese. So a very large ship with 1,300 people packed below decks. They probably weren't given very much run of the ship. I really doubt they were invited up to the first class saloons and other amenities that the first class passengers were enjoying. But there were no individual recorded names, so there's no record of who left Hong Kong in terms of the steamship lines. So it's difficult to track individuals. In terms of actual documentary evidence of Chinese at the Rancho, I found the census, the 1880 US Census, and this is a shot of what it looks like. It's a little bit hard to read, but basically a person's position in the household would be described in two ways, much like our modern census. One was a relationship to the head of the house, in which case they would be designated as a spouse, a child, a servant, or even a boarder, and their occupation, servant, gardener, chambermaid, laborer, a herder, or a cook. In looking at these for Rancho, I also compared it to the San Pasqual census, because the census takers accidentally recorded the Johnson family as living at both locations. They did, but they should have only been listed on one particular census form, their primary home. But they have many problems with ages and spelling. And if you cross compare those two census entries, they don't spell the names the same, and the ages move up by 2 to 3 to 5 years for the same individual. And in the case of the Johnsons, people were moving between households, not only the primaries, the Johnsons themselves, but some of their servants. So if you transcribe this, it gets a little bit clearer, but here you can see that between the two households, there were in fact 5 Chinese workers associated with the Johnsons. For San Pasqual, it detailed the place of birth as Canton, but Penasquitos, it basically just said China. I did note that there was a accuracy problem, obviously, in recording the names. The census takers were having a very, very hard time with the Chinese names. What they were hearing and what they wrote down wasn't necessarily what these individuals were saying. Cantonese has 6 different dialect inflections. That's what these numbers refer to, that in fact, they were just doing their best to try and write down what these individuals were telling them at the time of the census. I think that in reality, quite possibly the gardener was moving between both locations, that this individual may in fact be this individual. They have the same occupation, their age is very, very close. It's also interesting to note that they had similar problems with Hispanic names and even English names. It was definitely a multi-ethnic workforce at these ranches. There was one individual named Mary Pond. She was recorded as being born in New York, which was where the Johnson family originally came from. And she was basically listed as a chambermaid, but between the two censuses, they abbreviated her name from Pond to Pon, P-O-N, and changed her age from 26 to 18, the same individual. So all we can say is that yes, based on this, we did have 5 Chinese individuals working within the household, and definitely 2 at Penasquitos. In looking at material evidence for the presence of the Chinese, basically prior to 2018, it was thought that there were no artifacts present at Penasquitos that would serve as an ethnic marker of their presence. And I wondered why not. The artifacts have been found at many other sites with the Chinese presence. And there were several possible explanations to this. 1, the population of these workers was too small to leave behind any trace. 2, the presence at the site was too brief. They weren't there long enough to really accumulate a lot of material remains. 3, the Chinese more or less treasured personal items and were very reluctant to get rid of them. Many of the things that we use as ethnic markers for the presence of someone were things that were actively being confiscated when they were on those steamships. When they would show up in San Francisco, the custom officials would search them for opium products, tobacco products, food, drink products, and because they had imposed an import duty on these things, they would just take them from them. So they really were stripped of things that we would be looking for later in the archaeological record. The other reason why we might not see a lot of material evidence for the presence of these individuals was that the Chinese were undergoing enculturation and assimilation, and they were beginning to adapt and use local products, not products that they would essentially get from home. And then the final reason is that we found little evidence is that no one's been looking for this. Simply no one's looking at the assemblage from Los Penasquitos for material that would be tied to Chinese. So you look at maybe a blue on white ceramic fragment and you just think that's China. That could just be a China plate, or something like this. Could just be a floral pattern. But if you really analyze the assemblage, then maybe these things are present. And in fact, there is evidence. So we've uncovered one ceramic sherd in 2019 associated with the bunkhouse. This is a very small blue on white ceramic, and it does bear the cursive Chinese character for alcohol, liquor, or wine. It was kind of a multi-use term. The content of this container would have been preferred by Chinese over local products. Definitely, that's why it's here. It's very unlikely that anyone who was non-Chinese would have been using this material. It would have been, you know, a sort of exotic liquor to them, and they probably wouldn't have had it. This little piece right here clearly indicates their evidence, but it also demonstrates that there was an active supply chain for Chinese goods in San Diego, and that these individuals actually had access to that. So somehow Chinese alcohol was coming across the Pacific. These individuals were seeking it out and actually trying to acquire it. The other evidence that we found is a Chinese coin with a hole in the center. This was found in the mid-'80s at the El Cuervo adobe that I showed you on the previous map. This is the coin recovered. Unfortunately, no one knows where this artifact is right now, and the photo isn't good enough to identify it, and they didn't take a picture of the reverse side. So it's difficult to know what we're looking at there, but it appears to match exactly the type of coins that are, you know, on display at the Chinese Historical Museum. What is interesting is that, again, in reference to looking at artifacts and not looking at them in the correct context, these objects down here, where do we go, also considered coins. This would be described as a knife coin. This is a square foot coin. If you're an archaeologist and you're digging up these things and you're getting them out of an area associated with a historical ranch, you might look at these things and say, well, this is a knife. It's not a Chinese coin. It's a fraction of a cooking tool or a kitchen tool. Or if you look at this piece right here, you might say, well, that's obviously part of a horse bridle or a wagon cart or something like that, where you're not interpreting them as a Chinese artifact. So we have evidence that they were here. So I thought a little bit about how did they get here? What was the story? And really there were two routes that they could have come to San Diego. One obviously is a sea trip. This is a picture of a steamer called the Orizaba. The Orizaba ran between San Francisco and San Diego and actually continued all the way down the coast to Panama. It made that run about every 2 weeks. It took about 2 weeks to get all the way down and 2 weeks to get back. Johnson himself used this all the time. There are multiple stories in the local newspapers from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Johnson and the family were traveling back and forth to San Francisco themselves and onto the East Coast. The other option is that they came somewhere along the inland route, either through some work employment somewhere outside of San Francisco. They could have been in Nevada. Obviously, they were working in Colorado on the steamship line. And here's a picture of the type of steamboats that were running up and down the Colorado River at that time. And it turns out Johnson himself is actually the connection. Johnson ran a steamship operation on the Colorado. That's where he made the vast fortune that allowed him to court the most beautiful woman in, California in 1859. And so it wasn't really clear, which way they may have come down. In this particular steamboat, there was a Chinese cook. He was well known for his cooking on the line, and people would remark that, he made very good stuff. But as it turns out, I found a newspaper article in the Union newspaper, 1876, that Johnson actually had imported 30 Chinese himself down to San Diego. So it's quite possible that the individuals working at his ranch were someone either off one of his steamboats or possibly the Chinese laborers that he brought down. And it was quite common for people to recruit labor for work at ranches. Looking at some of the Johnson family correspondence, they were talking about just, we needed someone to work in the house, so we went and got an overseas Chinese individual. very common. Eliza Johnson actually moved from the Rancho Pico to the central part of LA in 1874, 4 years later. And she's again mentioning a Chinese servant in her correspondence. And I wondered, is that the same individual? I mean, that would be a very long run. She must have been happy with this person, either found a replacement if she couldn't take that individual, or in fact kept the same individual working in their household, and just when they moved, the servants moved with them. By the late 1880s, Chinese labor was the majority of the labor on many ranches in California. So they had a very large presence in California at that time, and very successful. Unfortunately, there was a broader experience going on at that time. There was a lot of pushback against Chinese that often turned violent in urban areas. This was a scene of a massacre in Los Angeles in 1871, which a number of individuals were shot. And the report goes on in the paper to say that it was all staged. It was just anti-Chinese sentiment. There never were gangs fighting over control of anything. In fact, it was just basically pushback against a foreign culture. And Johnson himself, when he brought down that crew of laborers, he received a lot of grief from the local community in San Diego, saying that he was importing labor, wouldn't use local white workers. And Johnson was very adamant. He said, no, these guys will work better and harder than individuals locally in doing the same work. And so he was a very strong supporter of using Chinese labor. So in looking at what might have happened to these individuals on the ranch, Johnson actually sold the ranch in 1880. He moved off of it, even though he was still active in San Diego. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 really formulated a formal reaction against Chinese immigration to the United States. And as a result, a lot of farm and ranch workers were displaced in favor of other ethnicities and other labor sources. In California, that shifted the labor supply from Chinese individuals to Japanese, and later Japanese to local Mexican workers. And local indigenous people were working there as well. So these individuals that were more or less then being moved off of ranches and where they were working had to go somewhere. And it turns out they tended to shift down into larger cities that had some type of Chinatown. And in other areas of the West overall, they wanted to move to a point where they had a large Chinese community and they could find jobs. And at that time, we see the rise of Chinese benevolent societies, where these individuals were beginning to cluster together and seeking out protection in the group, and formulating their own strategies for continuing to exist within the US population. So if you look at the history of Chinatown then in San Diego, you can see on the left where we have this box showing roughly what Chinatown was. But there was a massive growth in this area between the early 1870s and the early 1900s, where it pretty much doubled. This was a collection point for Chinese who were being forced out of their traditional jobs, coming into cities, becoming store operators, restaurant operators, laundry operators, and really basically sustaining themselves through their own economic efforts rather than working for somebody else. So in looking at all that, I think it is safe to conclude that the presence of Chinese is supported by documentary material evidence. I think it's important to understand how the activities of all three sites fit together. There was ethnic separation of workers on ranches in California. This has been documented in looking at the bunkhouse structure. At the time of a fire in 1910, the owner of the ranch at that time, Monarchy, he himself had moved out of the JohnsonTaylor House to a new adobe and was now using the JohnsonTaylor House as the new bunkhouse after repairing it. Well, if there was a new bunkhouse, there had to be an old bunkhouse. And I think there was basically a practice of musical chairs, that as one group moved from an older accommodation to the newer one, then somebody else backfilled them. So there was obvious that we had these different workforces working on the ranch. At the time that Estefana Johnson died in 1926, the newspaper article had reported there used to be hundreds of people working on their rancho at one time. So these workforces were quite large and quite complicated, and managing your own workforce took some effort on the part of the ranch owners. They really had to put a lot of thought into it. But also in concluding this, I realized that historical archaeology must use both artifact analysis and documentation to answer research questions, and that if you wish to study ethnic group dynamics at individual sites like the Johnson-Taylor House or Rancho Peñasquitos, you really need to consider the broader patterns of intergroup relationships, the things that were happening throughout the West and throughout California at that same time. So that's basically it. If there are any questions, we can take those.
All right, thank you, Mark. So just as a reminder, if you would like to ask questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question or make your comment. Or if you prefer, you can also type your comments into the chat and I can read those out as well.
I have a question. So I've been a docent at Rancho Peñasquitos for a couple of years and love the place. And this is the first I've heard of Chinese there. And so this is an exciting development as far as I'm concerned. Did you only look at the 1880s census, or did you look at other census after that?
I was trying to get access to 1870 and 1890, but I didn't get access to it, unfortunately. But I know that later by 1910, there's some correspondence from Monarchy's family that talks about the cooks no longer, they certainly weren't Chinese, they were described as being French. So certainly by 1910, they had shifted away from the general practice that they had been following.
I have a question, actually more of a comment and a question. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I'm looking in the opposite direction. I have two screens up right now. I excavated at El Cuervo when I was in college at San Diego State, so I do vaguely remember the Chinese coin.
Okay.
And I work for the city of San Diego, so I'm staff archaeologist. I do know where the collection is. I think right now it's with our former consultant, but I made some notes, and so I'm going to contact the project manager for the El Cuervo Adobe project, because the city is working on some interpretation of that site in light of the damage that occurred to the adobe back after the storms from a few years ago, and we lost another one of the walls. So we have found some more artifacts there, as a matter of fact, since that time. Not any Chinese, but some displaced artifacts that were in the adobe walls that had fallen. And so the collection was going to be brought up to current standards and then curated. But things happened with the contract and stuff. So, I mean, there's a whole history behind it. And then the city changed course on what they were going to do out there. But I will contact them to find out exactly where the collection is right now. And if there's a way that we can get some better pictures of that coin for you, I will make sure that it happens.
That'd be fantastic. I was hoping somebody might have some information.
Yeah, and you can contact me through SDCS to have my email and stuff. But yeah, I'm really interested in there may be more stuff in the collection. I haven't looked at that in a long time, and I'm hoping that we can help somehow to like find other students that are interested too in learning more about what happened at that El Cuervo site. So it's kind of cool that your discussion wound up tying it in. So I'm really happy about that. I like to see that site interpreted better than the way we do it today. So
Good. Yeah, I think there's more work to be done there. Dr. Payne had acquired a permit to do some survey work there, and
yes, yeah,
that work was delayed because of COVID, and we would have been out there this summer, I think, maybe around May or June, to be doing a little bit more investigation into the site. No excavation, but just some surface mapping.
right. And I think some drone work. Weren't you guys going to
Yeah.
do the drone overfly, which I was really excited about? So I think that there's a lot more to learn about that
Yeah.
side of the canyon that then
Mhm.
ties everything all together with the adobe and with the Monarchy adobe and the other, you know, everything. It's a very diverse and very, I think, that whole area is just active. There's so much information, so much to learn. There's stuff in Lopez Canyon that we don't really know everything about. So
Yep.
this is
Yeah.
good. Thanks. I have a note right here. I want to show everybody can see. I have a note. It's going to happen. I'll make sure you get that information.
Yeah, I mentioned there was potentially a fourth site that might need to be looked at, and maybe after the Q&A, if anyone wants to, I can jump through that. I have a couple of slides. Any other questions?
Yeah, Mark, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Did you have access to the collections that City College and Mesa and other people have done around the large adobe itself?
I looked at the collection that's there on the site in the JohnsonTaylor House. There were about 20 different banker's boxes full of things. I went through all of that. There were no Chinese artifacts, but I found a lot of other material evidence from different periods at the site.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question from our chat. What records are there of pay rates for the overseas Chinese workers? Were the pay scales different among the various workers?
Good one. I didn't find any documents relating to pay for the workers at the ranch, but when I was looking at the steamboat operations and trying to trace individuals back that might have been the individuals reported on the census, I thought there might be pay records on file somewhere in Arizona associated with the steamboat operations. And if I could find, you know, personnel records and pay records, that might be what you're describing right there. There probably were disparities. Definitely there was pay discrimination between the different ethnicities working on the ranch. There was a logging operation in Northern California where there was some information about pay, and the Chinese workers were paid less than the white workers. Although the cooks typically were the best well paid out of any of the Chinese workers. They really valued their efforts in keeping the workforce healthy and productive when performing their tasks. They knew that people performing heavy labor really needed very good food. And it's been reported that, you know, on the Chinese railroads, the railroad workers were eating way better than they would have been eating in China because of the demanding nature of that work. And so the crews, keeping the crews moving and well-fed was a very big part of it. At one point on the steamboats, they did experiment with deck crews. So they were, you know, adding in Chinese workers on the ships, but they didn't really pursue that and actually reversed course for some reason. So.
I actually have another question from the chat. Is there any correspondence that ended up in possession of the families? And also, is there a name for the cook on the boat that traveled the coast?
Yeah, the name of the cook was, I think, William Sam. Oh, not on the coast. He was on the steamboat. And his name was William Sam. And that was 1873. I don't know about the Orizaba. Who crewed that one?
And then the other part was, is there any correspondence that ended up in possession of the families?
Correspondence, there was a lot of correspondence between the Johnsons because there were multiple brothers and sisters-in-laws, and they kept writing back and forth. A lot of what I found was on file there in the JohnsonTaylor House in their archives. Their archives is a small closet with a bookshelf, And a lot of my research is really pulling from stuff that other people have done, research that has been done and they've left behind. So I really benefited from a lot of stuff that I had quick access to. I didn't have to go out and do a lot of things. But because of that, I didn't find a lot of stuff. I mean, I was like the census information. I found the census information that somebody else had collated for me for 1880, and therefore I didn't have immediate access to other primary census reports, unfortunately. But there were a lot of newspaper reports, a lot of personal letters, things of that nature. And it was very, very insightful too. I mean, I'm sitting in these people's house, I'm reading the letter between one brother or a sister, and you really feel like you get to know these individuals. They're talking about the death of one of the Johnson's daughters, and the experience of seeing the body laid out in where whatever location it was in. It may have been San Francisco, it may have been San Diego, remarking that the deceased looked good and basically did not, they didn't have any problems with decay or anything. So you really get to know the people. If you read their letters, it's interesting.
One source of information on census is the LDS Church has a history center in Mission Valley. Are you familiar with that?
I know the Mormon Church does a lot of ancestry and genealogical record tracking.
Yes.
If there's something local I can get to, that would be great. I did check with the San Diego History Center a couple weeks back just to try and pull in a little more information, and unfortunately they're not allowing individuals to do in-person research, and I couldn't get any response from them. But yeah, the Mormon resources, yeah, I know they're out there.
The 1790 census, it was a combination of fires and wars and a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So you'll find very few records from 1790. But the Chinese and the 7 families from San Francisco did a lot of contract labor on the Hotel Del Coronado was mostly built with Chinese labor. The train that ran out from Powder Point was all built by Chinese labor. The Spreckles Railway was really all built by Chinese labor. Even the San Diego Flume was all Chinese labor. So you can get more information from the Chinese History Center on just how far and wide they really participated.
Yeah, I did make an inquiry with the Chinese Benevolent Society there in Chinatown, and their membership rolls didn't go back to the 1880s, unfortunately. They referred me back to someone in San Francisco. But because the record keeping was so bad, it's very hard to track individuals at that time.
Well, I've never heard any resource particularly, but there were the 7 families in San Francisco, and somehow they must have kept some records of just who they were and what they did.
I'll look into that. I'll see what I can find. Thank you.
Mark? Well, first off, a comment. I've long felt that there should be a National Register thematic district including all 3 of the adobes, rather than just Johnson-Taylor. It's all part of one, as you've indicated, one history, really. But I think this is the first time I can remember hearing any mention of San Pasqual in connection with Johnson. What can you tell me about that?
Apparently he had a house in that area, enough of a house to warrant being census, surveyed. And I don't know the location of it, unfortunately. I know Johnson had multiple houses. I believe he also owned something in Old Town through that same time. But unfortunately, that's about it. It shows up in the census for that year with those individuals.
Do you have any idea, Richard?
Oh, pretty much what Mark is saying. I've seen the name occasionally in the newspapers at the time, and for Johnson being there. And at one point, when Manasseh had a store down there, Johnson was one of the suppliers to Manasseh's store, bringing things in by ship down the Colorado River. But it's all kind of just ephemeral. So I don't know the location of the house or how permanent the house was. But apparently when the census taker came through, he was there that particular week or month. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a suggestion, and might be a source that you haven't looked at yet, Mark. The City of San Diego City Clerk's Office, they have a vast archive, and they've like started to digitize a whole lot of stuff, lots of really old records. You can go online. I don't know for certain how detailed this stuff for San Pasqual is, but because that whole San Diego River Valley is, that watershed is owned by the city of San Diego, they have a lot of information about the built environment that's there, and even some of the information from before. And Richard, I think, used some of those sources when he was doing some of the work for the city or some of our cultural resource studies and stuff. There may be something, you may get lucky. It's amazing the things that they have pulled out of the archives for Archives Month each year, and we had no idea that it even existed. I think they had something that tied back to, gosh, to George Marston that I'd never seen before, and it was something that he had signed. I off the top of my head, I can't remember what it was, but it was so cool and it was so different. I took a picture of it and I sent it to Nikki McGinnis, who is, a lot of people on this know her. She's a city employee also, but she's a descendant of George Marston, and nobody had seen that before. And so it was really cool. So they have lots of cool stuff, but you might actually be able to find something that ties back to that time period, because people were giving things to the city back then, before there wasn't a historical society. And so a lot of family members turned all that stuff over to the city of San Diego. And so now that they're archiving it, and yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff in there. So
Okay. Yeah, the research just goes on. It just keeps going. You can keep
it does. And there has been some overlap with the History Center, and the city is starting to get some of those materials back from them. So what might have shown up in a journal article as being at the History Center may actually now be at the city of San Diego's clerk's archives.
Okay.
So that's a source that you can go to.
All right, thank you.
There's also another source. It's the county. I did a lot of historical research on houses in the 1860s or 1870s, 80s. And the county has what they call miscellaneous records. And I was just dumbfounded at the amount of stuff that I found on the county's miscellaneous records. But it's a lot of page flipping and searching volume by volume, because it's a hodgepodge. But it's interesting. If you've got some time, just go look at it.
Okay. Thank you.
Filed under miscellaneous.
Yes, filed under miscellaneous.
That's everything.
Mark, do you intend to continue this research?
Well, possibly. It's one avenue of things that I'm interested in. I am interested in the steamboats on the Colorado. So there's that, kind of the history of Yuma. So, and again, it's all sort of a Johnson connection. It's all happening within George Johnson's, realm.
Yeah.
Everything at the Rancho, things in Yuma. He was involved in politics in Sacramento. So.
Yeah, I would not inflict this on you, but John P. Harrington, back in 1925, when he came through the Penasquitos Canyon, he gives some Kumeyaay place names and a whole bunch of other information, but he talks to a Mexican woman who was there at the time, 1925, and she related a story that Johnson had his life saved by a Quetzal Indian on the Colorado River. I don't know if it was from drowning or some accident. It wasn't from Indians attacking him. It was something like that. And so then in return, he told that the Kushan gentleman, anytime you want to come to San Diego, I'll put you up and take care of you. And he did. And he actually lived at the adobe there for a while as a ranch hand, and was paid a pretty good salary to do that. And then he would disappear for some months and then pop back up. And so he perceived Johnson to be his benefactor, and Johnson felt that he owed him his life. So I mentioned that because, in digging around, out there. Archaeologically, people might find some things that might reflect Native American use, but in the historic period rather than earlier on. And it ties into the steamboats and the river and what you're doing with Johnson. So I can send you that citation and you can look at it on.
Sure, that'd be great.
The notes are online now. But don't start reading them too much because you'll go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah,
that happened down there about 30 years ago. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I've got one bit of trivia. We moved our office into the Yuma building in Gaslamp in 1975. And the Yuma building was built by a man who owned the steamboats on Yuma and lived in Yuma, but came to San Diego and built his building and had his business here in San Diego.
Okay.
Just another bit of trivia.
Yeah, it just keeps going.
Well, thank you.
All right,
Hey, Mark, I have a question. I'm working on a project on Otay, and your discussion on the post-1882 disbursement of Chinese off of as a labor pool. There's some tentative archaeology that suggests that there was Chinese presence at this location, and I was wondering if you can explain what you know about the disbursement of the Chinese labor pool off of these ranchos into the broader communities, as opposed to just going into, say, the benevolent societies in the downtown districts, but maybe you have some information on as to how people negotiated their labor skills across the landscape rather than just downtown.
Well, I think the displacement of the workers, so the Exclusion Act didn't say anything about existing workers. It was mainly shutting down the immigration of new individuals. So it was beginning to restrict the flow of people into the United States. It had a specific component that said no Chinese women were to be allowed in, because they really began to be worried about, you know, all these individuals beginning to build communities and, you know, how to deal with all of that. So their displacement off the ranches wasn't necessarily linked to the act. I think their displacement from existing jobs was really highly dependent on their situation. Some ranches said, no, you can continue to work here, no problem. And that's why the presence on ranches continued into the late 1880s. And it was really sort of a lot of things that were happening in more urban settings that were driving it. Maybe the workforce on a ranch was just fine, everything was great, but they were beginning to see stories about problems developing. That's when you started to see newspaper articles about opium dens and white slavery and the Chinese tongs and the gangs and all of these things. And that probably was developing out of these more concentrated urban settings. And that's what led to active programs in the early 1900s where they were trying to really drive people away from Chinatowns. The police were coming in and raiding opium dens and raiding the Chinese restaurants and bars. So I think the workforces did persist out, you know, at places for a long time. And it was a slow process that drove them. And also a lot of the overseas Chinese never intended to come to the United States to actually settle down permanently. Their idea was that they were coming just to do some work and go home. They might have thought, okay, I'm going to do this for 3 years and then I'm going to get rich and I'm going to go back to China. There's some information about El Paso and the Chinatown that was present there during the development of the second transcontinental railroad. And there was a big Chinese population. And when the railroad was complete, essentially they had no jobs. They were all fired from the railroad jobs. They returned to the Chinatown locations, and that Chinatown just evaporated. There was no reason for it to be there. The stores, the Chinese operated stores closed down, the restaurants closed down, and it just basically died on the vine. So there was a lot of movement from places outside California back to California because that was essentially their starting point. But yeah, there could be many, many other examples of large Chinese workforces in and around San Diego County. This is basically just the tip of the iceberg, just one microcosm of the whole story.
Yes, so there's clearly could have been a itinerant labor pool that was migrating around these local backcountry locations without much dissuasion from the authority figures of the central communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Richard, one thing you might want to think about too is a lot of that seasonal. So during sheep shearing season, both Native Americans and Chinese go out and do that during harvest for barley or oats or hay. And something, Richard, if you're down in Otay, you might want to think about is that there was a large Chinese population down in both Tijuana and Ensenada. And they, the border was was loose back then, and labor moved back and forth. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, Richard.
Well, you're so smart.
There's a lot of information in northern Baja about the Chinese population, and they've very well established, and they're still descendants of those original Chinese, that pool that used to cross what's now the border. They're still family members in Ensenada, San Quintin. I mean, they go as far south as San Quintin. Mexicali, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well documented. So you have a lot of research still to do, Mark.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. It could keep going. We'll see. The one thing I mentioned about Penasquitos as being potentially a fourth site might be tied to the stagecoach operations that came through that area. I haven't read much about it, but I found a little information about the stage lines that were being operated in San Diego County, and I know one of the lines passed through Los Penasquitos Canyon. There's a documentary report about an individual saying in the early 1900s was explaining how, here's what happened. You would ride from this area down through San Pascual, you would pass through Poway, you would pass into Los Penasquitos Canyon, you would pop up into Rose Canyon. So it was a documented type of travel. But I have a map that shows a dot on it that apparently was a stagecoach station of some kind right there that appears to be in the area of the JohnsonTaylor House. But I haven't seen anything that suggests people have been looking for it. When we were walking the site as part of the Palomar excavations, we didn't go up and venture too far away from where we were working to start doing surveys, but maybe there's some work that needs to be done there. And I found some historic photos that they're always tricky. You never know if the title of the photo is accurate, but there's a photo that may in fact show something in Penasquitos Canyon. I have a picture of it if you want to see it, but that's another line of investigation as well. Another piece of the puzzle.
The main road from San Diego going up to Warner Springs and that went through there, right?
Yeah.
And so and from what I understand, and what we tell people when they were coming on tours and that, is that people have to stop there, and they could stop and have a meal, they could spend the night or whatever. So people, they would have beds in every room in the house there. And so it could act as a kind of a stage stop, and people traveling through before they get to San Diego. But so anyway, that's,
well,
that's
I mean, there were the stage lines were described as either a home station or a swing station. The home stations were a little bit more extensive. There was a place people could get a meal and rest a little bit. The swing stations were only a horse changing operation. So you would roll up and maybe there was just a corral and a small building, and that's where they swapped out the horses, and your entire stop was only 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm not sure if Penasquitos was a very minimal stop or a more extensive one, but there was something going on there, definitely. And that would have made sense. I mean, with Johnson and his love of horses and operating a large barn, maybe he contracted with the stage line to provide horses. That was, about 20 miles from Penasquitos down to downtown, or to at least to Old Town. And so that would be a logical stretch to get fresh horses for. And typically, if you know anything about stages, the drivers of the stagecoach didn't go the entire route. They would only work about a 12 to 20 mile an hour stretch, or 20 mile stretch, because that was about all they needed to drive. And they wanted to have those drivers have a good understanding of the roads that they would be driving over. So they would change horses and change drivers, and then the coach would go on. So there may be something there in the canyon tied to that.
I was thinking about Johnson also with his racehorses and he went up to San Francisco with his racehorses, right?
Right.
So that would be another thing, but also the latter part of the 19th century when Porfirio Diaz didn't want Americans taking over the land down south, at the northern border there and in Mexicali area. They had a lot of Chinese, on the farms there and actually working the farming area in there. So he would have had some connection with the Chinese in that area even.
Yeah, he did like horses. He would typically buy them up in San Francisco and ship them down on the Orizaba. That was reported a couple times. He'd spend what to them were huge amounts of money on horses, several $1,000s per horse. There was a report when it was described as a calamity because one of his brand new horses died that had just, been imported, and then it didn't last on him. So he went back and bought 4 more. So interesting.
All right, I hate to interrupt this discussion, but I think we are reaching the end. If anybody does have more questions or comments they didn't have a chance to share, you're welcome to email us and we can pass them along to Mark. So once again, thank you so much, Mark, for today's talk. And
Sure.
thank you everyone for attending today's Brown Bag sessions. And remember, our next one in October will be Chicano Park. So thank you, everyone.